Welcome to the November the 30th, 1999 taping of It Happened in Grand Prairie, as we bring you the history of our city and we introduce to you some of the people that have been with us in the past and have gone away. And yes, we have them back today to document some very special history as a salute. This is our history tape number 383. And we have entitled this presentation From Pearl to Pearls, and that is in the plural. And we're very excited to have with us today a young man that had some experiences that was nearby to Pearl Harbor, because we're going to feature this on our December the 7th program history. And we're so pleased today to welcome Mr. Charles Mills Yater. Mr. Yater, welcome to the set, young man.
Thank you, hon.
We're so glad to have you with us, and Mr. Yater is very special in that he is a former Grand Prairian, and he lived in East Grand Prairie before it was even Grand Prairie, down near the Naval Air Base, and we're going to talk about some of those things at this time. And Charles Yater, you have a wonderful, wonderful history that you're going to help us highlight today, but let's start out with your permission and do your genealogy. Let's name your mother and your father and your grandparents, if you'd like to do that, and look out into our camera and tell us about them.
My grandfather, who was an old country doctor, delivered me. Not only that, as I was being born, my mother decided that he needed to raise me. And as a result, I was raised for 14 years by a wonderful, old-fashioned doctor and a lovable person, my grandfather, and of course my grandmother.
All right, now give us their names. I know their names, but we want you to document his full name.
His name was Dr. Charles M. Yater, of which I am the second, and the Rosetta Abney Yater was my grandmother.
Oh, wonderful. And you lived with them in what area?
I started in Roswell, New Mexico, and at the age of 5, we came to Cleburne, Texas, and then eventually I moved on into Dallas with my father and my stepmother, and from then immediately into Grand Prairie, of which step by step there's a lot of little intermediates between.
All right. Now, let's get back to your father. We need to document your father's name and your mother's maiden name.
Novella was my mother's name. My father's name was Max Abney Yater, the same initials as his brother, who was named May Yater. Max Abney Yater, M-A-Y, was the same as his brother, which was a May Yater.
And did your father have any more brothers or sisters?
My father had 2 sisters that I was raised with shortly after coming to Cleburne, and we had Fanny and Zanna Yater before they were married.
All right. Now, when you came to the Grand Prairie area, do you remember the approximate year that you came there? Down into the Idlewild community, where there was a wonderful little Idlewild school.
That would be in the neighborhood of 31 or 32.
31 or 32.
Yes.
And if Mr. Tovar, when he gets an opportunity, I'd like for him to pick up right underneath my chin this wonderful picture of the Idlewild School with the flag flying. And Louis, I think we have it well enough on this without your having to change the camera, because this gives you Idlewild School with the flag flying. And you attended there for how long, Mr. Yater, sir?
Just a short time at Idlewild.
Do you remember your teacher?
Do not remember the teacher.
Don't remember the teacher.
No. Just a few months.
Just a few months.
Before I went into Grand Prairie.
And then you decided to go up into Grand Prairie. Was that because your grandfather had an office there in Grand Prairie. I have a 1935 Grand Prairie Memorial Library microfilm copy. It says Dr. C.M. Yater, General Practice, Office Phone 15, Residence number 115. And I think Louis can pick this up also. There's the ad in the paper where your grandfather was a doctor here in the city of Grand Prairie, Texas.
That was a few years after my Idlewild and start at Grand Prairie High School.
Grand Prairie High School. All right, now from Grand Prairie, when you went to Grand Prairie High School, tell me a little bit about going to school up there. Did you ride the bus? Did you walk or bicycle or what?
That was back when they had the horse racing track here, and I was lucky enough to hitchhike back and forth to school. I had no automobile, and I was at that time 3 or 4 miles was a good walk, but I was lucky to get a hitchhiker ride back and forth to school.
All right. Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had a half brother and a full sister. Maxine, my sister.
Did she have another name?
Maxine Abney.
Okay.
And Paul Abney would be my half brother.
All right.
A brother by my stepmother.
All right, and let's get your stepmother's name because she was a wonderful lady that was good to me.
Fannie Lou
Yes.
was from Hallsville, Texas, and just got out of high school, came to work here in Dallas, and my father at that particular time was unmarried, and it wasn't long after that they became married.
All right, and living down at Idlewild, in the community of Idlewild, near the Idlewild School, there were about 9 houses along the end of the dam there that belonged to the Dallas Power and Light. Now, wasn't your dad associated with the Dallas Power and Light?
My father was 14 years with the Dallas Power and Light, and before the gates went in to create the lake, we used to go rabbit hunting and tried to be a little bit of a farmer, and had cows, rabbits, chickens, the whole bit, and of course unsuccessful with each enterprise.
Yes, yes. All right, in Grand Prairie High School, you had some special teachers. I'd like for you to name some of those teachers that you bring back to your memory.
My favorite, and I'm sure everyone, excuse me, I'm sure everyone becomes involved and thinks they're in love with one of their teachers.
Yes.
Maxine English taught me English, and I'll never forget, I just loved to go into her class, and she was such a wonderful person, and at that time Mr. Bodine was principal, and I recall he and his ruler.
Oh, yeah. Didn't take you long to get acquainted with his ruler because Mr. Bodine was a real special young man. And I believe he finally married Miss English, right?
They got married, and just completely ruined my future.
Ruined your life, didn't it? All right. And did you go all the way through Grand Prairie High School, or did you transfer to another school?
I went to, my father moved into Oak Cliff, and I spent the last 3 years of high school at W.H. Adamson.
W.H. Adamson.
It had just turned over
Wasn't
from
that
Oak
Cliff?
The year before, it was Oak Cliff High.
All right.
And then it was renamed W.H. Adamson.
Okay, all right. And you graduated from Adamson High in what year?
37.
In 1937, okay. In 1937, that was getting near the war years that we want to talk about, but what happened to Charles after he graduated from high school? Where'd you go? What'd you do?
My father insisted that I learn a trade.
Okay.
And he, being a mechanic, said, "Son, I don't care what you do, learn a trade. That's something no one can take away from you, and if times get hard, you can always find a good job." And he wanted me to go in and be a fingerprint expert he'd been reading about, and I had a certain artistic ability that I scribbled on all my notepads, And when I saw an ad that said artistic young man to serve apprenticeship as a jeweler, I went to work for Mr. Leon Rudberg just a few months after I graduated, and I'll never forget, he said, all I can afford to pay you is $5.50 a week to learn the jewelry business.
And did you have to transport yourself from Oak Cliff down to his place?
I walked from Oak Cliff to downtown Dallas at Commerce and Irving many times because I didn't have the car fare after I spent a nickel for a hamburger and a cold drink. I usually had to borrow 50 cents from one of the co-workers to continue the week.
All right. And then after you finished your apprenticeship or were in that, what happened to Charles? What was the next move in your life?
After I finished 8 months of apprenticeship work, I received an offer from Mr. Bob Orkin, at that time doing the designing and manufacturing of fine jewelry for Neiman Marcus. That was the beginning of about a total of 15 years that I spent with Mr. Orkin, and as he later told me, I was the fastest and most accomplished repairman and manufacturer that he had ever had in about 50 of his sub co-workers.
How wonderful.
And so that was quite a compliment to me.
And then all of a sudden the war came along, and what happened to Charles?
The draft notice sent me, the people sent me a notice and said, in 2 weeks you are to report to Mineral Wells. And at that young age, I believe I was 21 or 20 and a half. And I decided to be one of the smart young draftees, so I went in and asked where the volunteers would be sent. I had an option of going to the Philippines in the infantry, the artillery in Hawaii, or the Air Corps in St. Louis. I wanted to see a beautiful place like Hawaii, and of course at that time the war was over in Europe, heavy, and this put me halfway around the world from the fighting, so I thought. And as a result, I volunteered, and in 3 days I was on a train to San Francisco and right on to the ship, the SS Edelin, which was a converted cattle boat.
Yes.
And I'll never forget that trip of 35 days.
35 days.
On the water, stacked up with young boys that 95% of us decided that we weren't seamen the first week out.
The first week out. All right, and that took you to which one of the Hawaiian islands to go into the artillery?
Okay, they put me in at Oahu, and the barracks, which was a training barracks at Schofield Barracks, and I felt it wasn't necessary because I'd had ROTC and National Guard here, and they put me in charge of some crews because of my experience. And I got there sometime, it would be early September, that I arrived at Schofield Barracks. That was the beginning of a ranger training that we went through, and I lived through it, but barely.
Just barely. That was tough, wasn't it? All right, we're leading up to what happened on December the 7th, even though you were not at Pearl Harbor. Give us your reminiscences about that day and that morning and what led up to that.
I was, I'll never forget, I had a double-breasted brown dress suit, and we were all getting on leave that morning and fixing to go into Honolulu, and we always went to the YMCA, and we had good food to eat and different places to go to in town. At the two hotels, the Moana and the Royal Hawaiian, were the only two hotels on the entire island.
I see.
And as we were getting prepared to go, we had to line up outside our barracks door at the kitchen. And I was about 10th in line, and someone yelled, Wheeler Field must be having maneuvers. And I could look over my shoulder and see Coley Coley Pass, which is an indenture in the mountains that we would take a full pack and go about every 2 or 3 days up over this mountain pass. So I told one of the boys with me, I said, well, I said, if they are, they're sure shooting at us kind of low. And about that time, it's hard to believe that our 3-story barracks had Japanese pilots flying below the top of a 3-story barracks, and I could actually see the pilot's face when they strafed us. Oh. And naturally, we all ducked behind the building as much as possible, and then 3 of us went out and picked up 2 of the boys and did what we could for them and brought them in. And it took 1 hour for a colonel to come over and kick the door in to get our rifles, our ammunition, and we by then had our clothes on and everything that we could take in our pockets heading for a truck.
Yes. And when you got in the truck, where were you supposed to go?
We were, some officer decided that the safest and best place would be Eucalyptus Forest, which is about 5 miles out of Schofield, and we loaded up as fast as we could, dreading any moment to be strafed with the additional planes that were coming over. But I could see from that vantage point Pearl Harbor and the ships being blown up, and the water tower next to our barracks was actually bombed with one of the small bombs from a Japanese plane. And they thought it was evidently a gasoline storage, yes. But it was a water tower. And we got up to Eucalyptus Forest and deployed and waiting any moment for the invasion. And my firm belief, 1,000 Japanese soldiers could have taken the entire island at that particular time.
At that time?
It was just...
You just weren't fortified enough.
No one could dream what was happening, that here were these little Red Zero planes coming in, strafing and bombing, and no word or caution or preparedness whatsoever.
All right. And living through that one day, what kind of communications did you all have to get the word from them? Were there radios, or how did you keep in touch?
I was in the radio division of the field artillery, and of course we had the code key, mm-hmm. But real quickly we had to string wire through the gullies, and as well as barbed wire, we had to also string telephone lines up to the OP at the top of the mountain, and we would spend 2 days and 2 nights on the mountaintop. Then they would let us come down and spend a night at one of the Navy homes that was on the beach right at the base of the mountain. And that went on for 10 or 11 months.
10 or 11 months. How far were you in actual miles or meters from Pearl Harbor, from where your artillery...
Schofield Barracks, this is a rough guesstimate, I would say probably 6 to 8 miles.
6 to 8 miles.
Mm-hmm. We were up in the kind of mountain area, high area, and we could look down and see
everything that was going on.
We could see Honolulu, we could see Pearl Harbor, and the whole bit.
All right, and did you remain in that forest for that 11 months?
10 or 11 months.
10 or 11 months.
We actually built log cabins to live in out of the trees in the forest, and we would have to string barbed wire, and we were on duty 4 hours and off 4. The entire 24 hours, day and night.
Day and night. Mm-hmm. That's certainly hard to develop a sleeping pattern, for Pete's sake. How many men were involved in your artillery company that you're talking about?
I was with Headquarters Company, and There would be anywhere from 30 to 40.
To 40.
And then there was A, B, C, and D, the howitzer division that had the 155 howitzers.
Yes.
And they would fire missions, and we would sit on the OP and direct fire, so that in case we did have an invasion, they would be sitting back and lob the 155 over the mountain in certain areas that were coordinated.
How did you get your supplies, your artillery, your food, and etc.?
I know we went very close to running completely out just in experimentation and practice, but all of a sudden the supply ships started coming in from the United States.
Yes.
And I mean, they were pouring it into us, and all of a sudden we had better clothes, we had a little bit better food to eat, and it just worked out real good.
Oh, that was wonderful. All right, after you left the Hawaii area, you stayed there 11 months, then where did Charles go?
We all got on a troop ship after practicing loading and unloading off of the ship with the nets, and I'm trying to remember the time it took. I remember the time it took to come back from Leyte, but going over, I'm going to say close to a month, maybe 35 days, to go directly to Sydney, Australia.
All right.
And
why so far to Australia?
That we had to go to Australia because at that time the Navy and we had Guadalcanal being bombed and strafed, and some pretty heavy action up in northern part of Australia in Dutch New Guinea, which my outfit went to Rockhampton right out of Brisbane, and then we would wait 6 months there, move into the Guadalcanal area, and then be prepared on the Isle of Goodenough to invade the Philippines.
Oh.
All this went on now.
You were just building a group, a force to go into the Philippines.
This is when the Navy and the Air Corps was at Midway and all the other, and the Solomon Islands, and in that group. We were kind of in reserve, and when I say reserve, the Air Corps and the sailors and the engineers seemed to get the first shipment of food, and we got what was left. But,
and you were glad to get that?
And we were glad to get what we did. I can only remember about 3 issues of beer, and not being a beer drinker, my 3 cans that they allowed come in to each one of us about every month, I would sell for $10 a can.
Way to go. Already you're an entrepreneur wanting to make money. All right, and then after your experiences there, did you go into the Philippines?
From Guadalcanal and the Isle of Goodenough, we went into Leyte.
All right.
We backed up the initial Marines and the infantry division that went in just ahead of us, and we went in through Leyte in the loading ships that had the ammunition and the 155 howitzers with us.
And then where did you go after that?
There I went into Mindanao, and we made 4 landings, and one of them was we took back Corregidor, and I'll never forget. I had a group of 25. At that time, I was sergeant, and I had a group of 25 soldiers, and our job was to unload a shipload of ammunition on the island of Corregidor.
All right.
And I'll never forget. I saw the paratroops taking over the island ahead of me, and when I saw 50 to 100 of those boys miss the cliffs, and so many of them died in going into the ocean instead of being dropped just to perfection right on the island.
On the island.
And we went in and liberated the Corregidor.
All right, and after Corregidor, what? And we have about 3 minutes left.
Okay, after Corregidor, and I went back into Mindanao, and we started cleaning out pockets of the Japanese and securing the entire island of the Philippines. And after that, I'd accumulated more points than anyone in the entire division, and they decided to send me home just as the war suddenly was just about over, and my outfit went into Japan.
All right.
And I
you
missed
didn't get to
that.
go. You missed Japan. And you came back to the United States, and were you back in the jewelry business?
I immediately came back from, and I couldn't wait to get back into the jewelry business, and for another couple of years, I continued working, and then walked in and left Mr. Orkin, started my own business in '51, and after he said he didn't think I could make it because of my lack of bookkeeping knowledge.
You found a good bookkeeper.
But a year later, I wrote him a check for his entire business.
Oh, way to go. Now, we've got to get your family in here. We have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
And name us your wife and your sons that are in business with you, and you have this wonderful jewelry place over in Preston Center. Wrap it up real quick for
Real
me.
quickly, my wife, Bobby Yater, takes care of the finances and the front of the store. I have two great boys, and Greg, Mark Allen and Charles Gregory, and we get to work at 6:30 in the morning, work all day long, have a wonderful business, and I bought the land and established a new, and they tell me, the most beautiful jewelry store in Dallas, Texas.
Right, and it's in Preston Center and
On Sherry Lane.
on Sherry Lane. All right. And you hope to be there forever and do all of these good things and make all of this beautiful jewelry. And I have some of the pieces that you've created for me, and I don't get to wear them anymore.
I refuse to retire.
You refuse to retire. Well, Mr. Charles Yater, we want to thank you so much for bringing us our December the 7th special that we're going to show next week on our history show. And it was just real precious to have you with us.
You're a very, very dear, personal, close friend.
Thank you very much for being with us. And this is Ruthie Jackson reminding you that history is as we live and do.